Hi everyone, I'm Carl and today I will be making these swamp terrain pieces for Warhammer and Song of Ice and Fire. They are rather generic, so they will fit fine into any historical wargame too. And you can of course add extra colors and bits to make them as grimdark or elaborate as you like. To begin with, I taped over the hole in these old CDs and temporarily attached them to some bottle caps to lift them off the work table. Mixed up some of my paper modeling paste and built up the structure over them. If you want to make your own paste, the instructions are in the video with the Weirwood tree. But you can also use sculpta mold, air drying clay or any material you prefer. We're just building a shallow bowl shape here. CDs are great for bases since they have a nice regular shape and don't warp, but I think using them here was a mistake since they constrain the swamp pieces to vaguely circular shapes. If I had to do this again, I'd probably use an irregular shaped base. I had to mix up 2 batches of modeling paste since I did not make enough in the first batch, and found that I had nearly run out of polyfiller. Since I sometimes confuse laziness with science, I decided to mix it up anyway and see what happens instead of going out to buy more. This batch had a much lower proportion of filler to paper. It worked okay, but it took a lot longer to dry and cracked a bit, which does not usually happen when using a 1:1 ratio. In this case though, this would not be a problem, and I actually prefer the shallower pieces I made with this batch. Next I glued in a few stones and sticks. Only a few pieces to give some interest. I prefer this kind of terrain to be kind of a background piece, and adding lots of stuff makes it too noisy. Besides, since this would be my first time working with resin, I was certain I would make some mistakes which I would need to cover up. By starting with a simpler layout, I gave myself space to add more detail if I wanted to. Of course, if you want to add in any skulls or weird things in here, it's your terrain, go for it. Once the glue holding the sticks and the stones dried, I mixed up some texture paint. This is just PVA glue, acrylic paint and construction sand. The ratios don't really matter. I put in enough paint to get the color I wanted and slowly dumped in roughly as much sand as there was glue, stirring all the while. Then I mixed in just enough water so that it became easily spreadable with a brush, and painted it onto the pieces. Use an old brush for this and make sure to wash it out as soon as you're ready. Also, this stuff really sticks to everything, so make sure you cover your work surface. Okay, once the texture paint was dry, it was time to paint up the stones and sticks, and add some contrast. I didn't want to dry brush this because it tends to make things look drier, so I mixed a very thin wash of burnt umber, and started to paint it on. Turns out the wash was too thin and it wasn't taking, so I ended up just dumping it all over the model. I don't mind the end result, but it did take ages to dry, and it introduced a problem which I only learned about later on. When all this was finally dry, I gave it all a light coat of sealer and started to apply the flock. First I painted watered down PVA everywhere I wanted to cover in flock, and then dumped the flock over it. In this case I used homemade flock I made with pine sawdust and green paint. After the PVA set, I cleaned out all the excess flock and dripped wet water over it. I did not just make the name up, it's really called wet water and is a 1:1 mix of alcohol and water. In my case I used surgical spirit, which is 99% alcohol if I'm not mistaken. Usually I just spray this on with a spray bottle, but since I don't want to get it everywhere, I dripped it on with a brush instead. It's not supposed to bubble, and the bubbles you see here are just from some soap left over in the brush because I did not rinse it properly. When everything was fully coated with wet water, I dripped diluted PVA onto it. The ratio is 1 part PVA to 3 parts water. The wet water sucks the glue in between the pieces of flock, so it's a lot more secure and dries faster. And once this was cured, I gave it another coat of sealer. Right, at this point I got ready to add the epoxy resin. To begin with, I made sure my table was level. This is important as the resin will self-level to a certain degree, and it will do so in relation to the surface. At a rough estimate, I thought I'd need about 60 grams of resin to fill these swamps up, and I wanted to do that in 2 layers. I'm not going to go into the details of the resin mix because they're all different, so read the instructions in your product. In the first mix, I also added in a tiny amount of ultramarine blue. Just a tiny droplet off the tip of a kebab stick. This gave a slight tint without making it opaque. Now, I know there are a bunch of ways to avoid bubbling in the resin, but since this was a swamp, I wanted the bubbles in it, so I didn't do any of that. And here's where the problem I mentioned earlier cropped up. Because the bottom of the pieces was very dark, the tint in the resin made it look nearly black. It's not a disaster and you can still see a bit of the bottom with a blue tint, but not as much as you would if it was a clearer color. Oh well, good enough. I left this to harden for a full day. Finally, I mixed up another batch, no paint this time, and poured that in, and after a day it was good to go. I'm pretty happy with the end result, even if it did end up a bit dark. The thing I'm not entirely happy with are these splashes around the edges, where I accidentally dripped the resin in the wrong places. I will probably revisit them in the future and hide them with more flock, some kind of vegetation or something like that, but that will be the subject of another video. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and if you have any questions, tips or suggestions, please do leave a comment below. Thank you for watching and hope to see you soon.